Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the source material you share with us, articles, research, maybe revision notes like today, and really dig in to pull out the important stuff. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a challenging topic based on the revision notes you've sent over. We're focusing specifically on Huntington's disease.
That's right. Think of this as us walking through those notes together. Our aim here is to unpack the key info, explain the more technical bits, and really help you lock in those high-yield points on Huntington's disease for your revision, or just, for understanding it better. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's jump right in with the basics from the material you gave us. What exactly is Huntington's disease?
So the source defines it fundamentally as a hereditary neurodegenerative disorder. What's really crucial to get up front is that it hits people in, three main areas: their motor function, their cognitive abilities, and also psychiatric symptoms.
And the notes make it really clear it's genetic,
Mhm.
caused by a specific mutation inherited in an autosomal dominant way.
Exactly. That genetic link means it runs strongly in families. The notes also really stress it's progressive, gets worse over time, and sadly, it's incurable right now.
Yeah, that's tough.
It is. It's typically fatal,
Yeah.
often maybe 15 to 20 years after symptoms start. And the material notes that common causes of death are things like pneumonia or, quite tragically, suicide.
It's interesting, the notes also touch on the history. It wasn't just discovered yesterday.
No, not at all.
The source mentions it was first properly described by George Huntington way back in 1872.
Yeah, a foundational piece of the puzzle right there in your notes.
Okay, so moving from what it is to why, the material goes into the etiology, the cause, and that HTT gene mutation is central again.
Yes, absolutely. The root cause highlighted in the notes is that mutation in the HTT gene. This specific change leads to the body making an abnormal version of the Huntington protein.
Right.
And like you said, the inheritance is autosomal dominant. That's a key point. Just one copy of the faulty gene from a parent is enough.
The source uses some pretty technical genetic terms here. Trinucleotide repeat disorder, CAG repeats, chromosome 4p16.3. Can you break that down a bit more simply?
Sure, yeah, let's unpack that. Think of genes like instruction manuals. In Huntington's, there's a specific part of the HTT gene where a three-letter sequence, CAG, gets repeated over and over.
Okay.
In people without HD, it repeats a normal number of times, but with the mutation, it repeats too many times. It's like a genetic stutter or an expansion.
Okay, a stutter.
Exactly. And the material tells us this gene with the stutter is on chromosome 4 at that specific location, 4p16.3. The number of these CAG repeats is really critical. Generally, more repeats mean it might start earlier and progress faster.
And your notes mention anticipation is possible. What's that about in this context?
Right, anticipation. It's a concerning phenomenon mentioned in the notes. It means that as the gene gets passed down through generations in a family, the disease can sometimes show up at an earlier age.
Oh.
Yeah, and maybe even be more severe. It seems to be linked to that CAG repeat length, sometimes getting even longer as it's inherited.
So this genetic stutter leads to this abnormal protein. What does that protein actually do wrong in the brain? The pathophysiology bit.
Right, connecting the genes to the actual problem. So the source explains this abnormal Huntington protein doesn't work properly. Worse than that, it's actually toxic. It builds up inside brain cells, making them malfunction and eventually die off.
Okay.
And the notes highlight this cell death isn't random. It's particularly bad in specific brain areas.
Which areas?
The material specifically points to the basal ganglia. That's a group of structures deep in the brain, really important for controlling movement, habits, learning, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And within the basal ganglia, an area called the striatum gets hit particularly hard. The notes say it specifically involves the degeneration of cholinergic and GABAergic neurons there. These are nerve cells using specific chemical messengers crucial for smooth movement and thinking.
So losing those specific neurons in the striatum is the core physical damage. That makes sense why you get the motor and cognitive problems then.
Precisely. That loss of those signaling pathways is, according to the notes, the mechanism driving symptoms like chorea, the movement issues, and the cognitive decline that can lead to dementia. The pathophysiology described really links the gene defect, the toxic protein, the affected brain regions, and the symptoms.
Okay, so given it's inherited, who does the material say is most at risk?
The notes are super clear on this. The number one risk factor, overwhelmingly, is having a family history of Huntington's because of that autosomal dominant pattern we talked about.
A 50% chance.
Exactly. If a parent has HD, each child has a 50% chance of inheriting that gene. Your notes explicitly state that gender and ethnicity are not specific risk factors. It affects all groups pretty equally.
That's actually a useful point for the material. Knowing what isn't a risk factor is just as important sometimes for revision. Okay, moving on. The notes list some differential diagnoses. I guess with that mix of symptoms, it could look like other things at first.
Yeah, that's a really important practical point covered in the material. Because the symptoms cross motor, cognitive, and psychiatric areas, HD can definitely mimic other conditions.
Like what?
The notes mention thinking about other neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, maybe certain types of ataxia, even Alzheimer's sometimes if cognitive symptoms are really prominent early on. Also, other psychiatric disorders, different movement disorders, other genetic conditions too.
So how do you tell them apart?
Well, the key nugget for revision here, which your notes really emphasize, is the genetic test. Testing for that specific HTT mutation is the definitive way to diagnose HD and rule out those other possibilities.
Okay, makes sense. What about how common it is? The material gives some epidemiology data for the UK.
Yeah, it gives a sense of the scale. The prevalence noted in the UK is around 6 to 7 cases per 100,000 people.
Okay.
And as we said, affects all ethnic backgrounds equally. The typical age symptoms start the onset is usually between 30 and 50, and it affects males and females equally too. Those are the key numbers from the notes to have in mind.
Right, here's where it gets, well, really crucial for understanding what it looks like day to day, the clinical presentation. Your notes structure this around that triad you mentioned earlier.
Yes, absolutely. That triad, motor dysfunction, cognitive impairment, and psychiatric symptoms, is the high-yield thing to remember from these notes about how HD presents. Should we break those down based on the material?
Yeah, let's do that. Motor first.
Okay, motor. The classic feature mentioned is chorea, those involuntary, jerky, almost dance-like movements. But the notes also mention dystonia, where muscles contract involuntarily, causing sort of twisting or abnormal postures. And later on, bradykinesia, which is slowness of movement, can appear, sometimes looking a bit like Parkinson's.
Okay, and cognitive.
Cognitive impairment covers problems with thinking. So memory issues, trouble with planning and reasoning, what we call executive functions, and this often progresses, sadly, to a form of dementia.
And the third part of the triad, psychiatric.
On the psychiatric side, the notes list things like depression, anxiety, irritability is a big one, obsessive-compulsive behavior sometimes, and even psychosis. And tragically, the material mentions again that suicide risk is significant.
And the notes stress these all get worse over time, causing more and more disability. It mentions the typical onset after 35, but also that juvenile HD before 20.
Exactly. That's important. Juvenile HD starts before age 20, and the notes say it often presents differently at first, maybe with learning difficulties or behavioral problems, before the obvious motor symptoms start.
So the symptoms evolve.
They do. That progression is key. Motor often starts with chorea but can shift towards more rigidity and gait problems later. Late-stage features listed include severe stiffness, spasticity, problems moving the eyes properly, gaze palsy, and changes in reflexes. Your notes also mention non-brain features like weight loss, muscle wasting, even heart issues like cardiomyopathy. So thinking about those three areas, motor, cognitive, psychiatric, and how they change is vital.
So how is the diagnosis actually confirmed? What investigations does the material say are done?
The material is really direct here. The definitive diagnostic test is the genetic test for the HTT gene mutation.
Looking for those CAG repeats.
Precisely. The lab counts the exact number of CAG repeats on chromosome 4 in your DNA sample. The notes state the result then puts you in a category. Normal number, an intermediate range, which might mean late onset or reduced penetrance, or a clearly abnormal number confirming the diagnosis.
But your notes add a really important point about the genetic testing itself,
Yeah.
beyond just the result.
Yes, and this is so crucial, the material really stresses it. Extensive genetic counseling is absolutely essential before someone gets tested.
Why is that so emphasized?
Because getting a diagnosis of Huntington's has massive implications, for the person, for their family, future plans, everything. The notes also point out that while the test confirms the gene, it can't predict exactly when symptoms will start. That uncertainty is a huge factor that needs discussing and counseling.
Okay. And the notes also mention things like MRI and CT scans.
Yeah, they do. These aren't diagnostic for HD itself, but the notes say they can be helpful. They can show brain atrophy, especially in the basal ganglia, as the disease progresses. And importantly, they help rule out other things that could cause similar symptoms, like a stroke or a tumor that you might see on a scan.
Right. Okay, let's talk management. You said earlier, and the notes confirm there's no cure. That's pretty sobering.
It is. That's the current reality presented in the material. No treatment available right now stops or slows the underlying nerve cell death. So the whole focus of management, according to these notes, is on treating the symptoms people have and providing really comprehensive supportive care. Ideally, the notes say, through a multidisciplinary team.
And the notes list specific medications for different symptoms.
They do, yeah. For managing the chorea, options listed include things like benzodiazepines, sodium valproate, tetrabenazine, and certain antipsychotics, neuroleptics. For the stiffness or slowness, the bradykinesia and rigidity.
The Parkinson's-like symptoms.
Right. The notes mention treatments similar to those used in Parkinson's might be tried, like levodopa or dopamine agonists. For psychiatric symptoms, depression can be treated with SSRIs, and the notes even mention ECT for really tough cases. And atypical antipsychotics are listed for managing psychosis.
Beyond the pills, what about the non-prescribing management and supportive care mentioned in the notes?
This is where that multidisciplinary team is absolutely key, as listed in your notes. You need neurologists, psychiatrists, genetic counselors, physios for movement, speech therapists, really important for communication and swallowing as things progress.
Swallowing becomes a big issue.
A major issue, yeah, leading to complications. Also, occupational therapists helping with daily tasks, counselors for psychological support. The material mentions psychotherapy and behavioral strategies can help with things like irritability, and it even notes advanced stuff like deep brain stimulation as a possible palliative treatment for really severe dystonia or chorea that isn't responding to meds. The whole approach is managing symptoms, maximizing quality of life.
Okay. Which brings us, inevitably, to prognosis. What do your notes say about the long-term outlook?
Well, it's described as progressive and ultimately fatal. The notes give that typical survival time after symptoms start as 15 to 20 years. But, and this is important, they highlight that the speed of progression and the age it starts can vary a lot between people.
Is there anything that predicts that variability?
The main thing mentioned is a correlation. Larger numbers of those CAG repeats tend to predict a faster deterioration. And as we touched on before, death is often from complications like pneumonia, infections, with suicide being the second most common cause noted.
And finally, the complications that tend to arise as the disease gets into its later stages.
Yeah, the notes list several significant problems that stem from that ongoing neurodegeneration. Obvious things like severe difficulties with moving around and doing basic daily living tasks, profound cognitive decline leading to advanced dementia, a much higher risk of infections because of swallowing problems, being less mobile, general decline.
And psychiatric issues continue.
Yes, persistent psychiatric challenges. And then, in the end stage, the notes specify things like aspiration pneumonia that's inhaling food or liquid due to swallowing issues, malnutrition from difficulty eating, and all the problems that come with being immobile. These are the tough consequences outlined in the material.
Wow, that was a really comprehensive run-through of the material you shared on Huntington's disease.
Yeah.
We've covered, well, everything from the specific gene fault right through to the clinical picture, diagnosis, management strategies, and the difficult prognosis and complications. Breaking down those notes really underscores what a complex and challenging condition it is.
It really does. Synthesizing all those points from the source material helps build that complete picture. You see the complex chain from that single genetic stutter to the specific brain changes it causes, and then the really wide-ranging impact it has on movement, thinking, and emotional well-being. You know, thinking about everything in these notes, it really brings up a crucial question, doesn't it? Beyond just the science, how do we truly ethically support individuals and families who are facing this kind of genetic diagnosis for an incurable condition, especially with that uncertainty about when it will start and that phenomenon of anticipation across generations? It's a profound challenge these notes raise.
Absolutely. A really important point to consider. Thank you for sharing this source material with us and letting us dig into it like this. If you listening want to revisit these points for your revision or maybe explore them further, your notes mentioned a couple of specific resources you might find helpful. Pass them to MSRA.com and freemsra.com. Sounds like they could be good places to build on what we've discussed today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.